30 casseroles showed up on American dinner tables every week in the 1950s.
Results? A perky new dish from a dependable old favorite.
Your grandmother made them. Your great-grandmother perfected them. They were in Betty Crocker's cookbook.
Just like that. You want to make sure you get all the tuna mixed in evenly.
Oh, I see.
Baked in glass Pyrex dishes and served straight from the oven to the table.
Pass the gravy, please.
Oh, you got it.
But today, you won't find a single one at a modern dinner party. We replaced them with takeout pizza and meal delivery kits. These weren't boring casseroles. They were one-pot dinners that fed 8 people for under $5, required 1 dish to clean, and tasted better than anything you'll order from a restaurant today. They vanished completely by the 1980s. We're bringing back all 30. Here's number 1. Original 1950s version. Tuna noodle casserole is probably the most famous casserole in American history, but the version you know, made with canned cream of mushroom soup, isn't the original. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe made everything from scratch. The casserole combined cooked egg noodles, canned tuna, fresh mushrooms sautéed in butter, peas, and a homemade cream sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and chicken broth. The whole thing was topped with buttered breadcrumbs and baked until golden and bubbling. In the 1950s, tuna noodle casserole was a weeknight staple because it was cheap, filling, and used pantry ingredients. A can of tuna cost 25 cents, egg noodles cost 15 cents, and everything else you probably already had. The casserole fed 6 people for under $1, an incredible value during a time when families were large and budgets were tight. The genius of the original version was the homemade cream sauce. Instead of opening a can of condensed soup, you made a bechamel, butter and flour cooked together, then whisked with milk until thick and creamy. This sauce was lighter, more flavorful, and less salty than canned soup. The fresh mushrooms added earthiness, the peas added sweetness and color, and the buttered breadcrumbs on top created a crunchy contrast to the creamy noodles below. The flavor of homemade tuna noodle casserole was surprisingly sophisticated. The tuna was flaky and mild, the mushrooms were meaty and savory. King Ranch chicken casserole is a Texas legend that became a nationwide favorite in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe layered torn corn tortillas with cooked chicken, sautéed onions and peppers, canned tomatoes with green chilies, shredded cheddar cheese, and a cream sauce made from chicken broth and sour cream. The casserole was baked until the cheese melted and the edges got crispy. The result was a Tex-Mex-inspired dish that was creamy, spicy, cheesy, and completely addictive. In the 1950s, King Ranch chicken casserole was popular across Texas and gradually spread to the rest of the country through church cookbooks and community fundraisers. The casserole was named after the King Ranch, one of the largest ranches in Texas, though there's no evidence the recipe actually originated there. It was more likely created by a ranch cook or a Texas homemaker who wanted to use up leftover chicken and stale tortillas. The genius of King Ranch chicken casserole was how it combined Mexican flavors with classic American casserole technique. The tortillas acted like lasagna noodles, creating layers. The chicken made it hearty. The tomatoes and chilies added spice and acidity. The cheese made everything rich and gooey. The sour cream in the sauce added tanginess that balanced the richness. The flavor was a perfect balance of spicy, creamy, and cheesy. The tortillas softened during baking but retained some texture. The chicken stayed moist. The peppers and onions added sweetness. The chilies added heat. The cheese on top got golden and slightly crispy around the edges. Every bite was different. Sometimes you got mostly chicken and cheese, sometimes mostly tortilla and sauce. Johnny Marzetti is an Ohio casserole that most people outside the Midwest have never heard of. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined ground beef, egg noodles, tomato sauce, onions, peppers, mushrooms, and cheddar cheese, all baked together until bubbly. The result was basically American goulash turned into a casserole, hearty, tomatoey, cheesy, and incredibly satisfying. In the 1950s, Johnny Marzetti was a Midwestern staple, especially in Ohio, where it originated. The dish was supposedly created by Teresa Marzetti, who owned Marzetti's restaurant in Columbus. She named it after her brother Johnny. The casserole became so popular that it appeared in school cafeterias, church potlucks, and family dinners across Ohio and eventually spread to neighboring states. The genius of Johnny Marzetti was its simplicity. You browned ground beef with onions and peppers, cooked egg noodles, opened a few cans of tomato sauce, and stirred everything together with cheese. Chicken and rice casserole was the ultimate one-pot dinner in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe combined raw chicken pieces, uncooked rice, canned cream of mushroom soup, water, and dried onion soup mix in a casserole dish, then baked everything together for 90 minutes. The result was a complete meal where the chicken cooked in its own juices, the rice absorbed all the flavors, and everything came out tender and flavorful. In the 1950s, chicken and rice casserole was revolutionary because it required almost no prep work. You literally dumped everything into a dish and baked it. The chicken didn't need to be browned. The rice didn't need to be cooked first. The soup provided all the liquid and seasoning. It was the definition of convenience cooking. The genius of this casserole was how the chicken fat rendered during cooking and flavored the rice. As the chicken baked, its juices dripped down into the rice, making every grain flavorful. The cream of mushroom soup created a creamy sauce. The dried onion soup mix added savory depth. The result was chicken that was fall-off-the-bone tender and rice that was creamy and rich. The flavor was comforting and homey. The chicken was juicy and seasoned perfectly from the soup mix. The rice was creamy and slightly sticky, almost like risotto. The mushroom soup added earthiness. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was exactly what you wanted after a long day. Chicken and rice casserole is still made today, but it's become unfashionable, seen as too reliant on canned soup and too 1950s, but the convenience is unbeatable. Ham and noodle casserole was the go-to recipe for using up leftover holiday ham. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined diced cooked ham, egg noodles, frozen peas, a cream sauce made from butter and milk, and topped everything with crushed potato chips. The result was a casserole that was creamy, crunchy, salty, and completely different from the original ham dinner. In the 1950s, ham and noodle casserole appeared the day after Easter, Christmas, and any other holiday that involved a large baked ham. Families would have pounds of leftover ham, and this casserole was the best way to use it up. The casserole was also economical. You'd already spent money on the ham, so turning it into another meal stretched your food budget. The genius of ham and noodle casserole was the potato chip topping. Instead of breadcrumbs, you crushed potato chips and scattered them over the top. During baking, the chips got even crispier and added a salty, crunchy contrast to the creamy noodles below. The combination of textures, soft noodles, tender ham, crispy chips, made every bite interesting. The flavor was simple but satisfying. The ham was salty and smoky. The cream sauce was rich and mild. The peas added sweetness and color. The potato chips added crunch and extra salt. It was comfort food at its finest. Ham and noodle casserole disappeared when large holiday hams became less common in the 1980s. Families started buying smaller, spiral-cut hams that didn't leave many leftovers. Tamale pie was a Tex-Mex-inspired casserole that combined the flavors of tamales in an easy-to-make casserole form. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered seasoned ground beef with corn, tomatoes, black olives, and topped everything with a cornmeal batter that baked into a cornbread-like crust. The result was a casserole that was savory, slightly spicy, and had a satisfying contrast between the meaty filling and the cornbread topping. In the 1950s, tamale pie was popular across the Southwest and California, where Mexican-American cuisine influenced home cooking. The casserole was easier than making actual tamales, which required making masa dough, filling it, wrapping it in corn husks, and steaming. Green bean casserole is a Thanksgiving staple today, but the original 1950s version was different. Betty Crocker's recipe made everything from scratch: fresh green beans blanched until tender, fresh mushrooms sautéed in butter, a homemade cream sauce, and topped with crispy fried onions that you made yourself by coating onion rings in flour and frying them in oil. The result was a casserole that was fresh, flavorful, and completely different from the canned version. In the 1950s, green bean casserole was created by the Campbell's Soup Company as a way to sell more cream of mushroom soup. But Betty Crocker's version predated that and used fresh ingredients. The casserole was popular because it turned plain green beans into something special: creamy, crunchy, and rich. The genius of the original version was the texture contrast. The green beans stayed crisp tender instead of turning mushy. The fresh mushrooms added meatiness. The homemade cream sauce was lighter and more flavorful than canned soup, and the fried onions on top were incredibly crispy and sweet from caramelization. The flavor was clean and fresh. The green beans tasted like actual vegetables instead of canned mush. The mushrooms were earthy and savory. The cream sauce was rich but not gluey. The fried onions added sweetness, crunch, and a slight bitterness from the fried flour coating. Green bean casserole changed in the 1960s when the Campbell's version using canned soup and French's fried onions became standard. 7 casseroles down, 23 to go, and you're already seeing the pattern. These weren't just convenient dinners. They were recipes that turned cheap ingredients into meals that fed entire families.
This is so good.
We replaced them with takeout and meal kits that cost 3 times as much and taste worse. But here's the thing: every single one of these casseroles still works. They're not outdated. They're not gross. They're practical, economical, and delicious. The next set of casseroles gets even more forgotten. These are the regional specialties, the ones that never made it outside their home states. Let's keep going. Tater tot casserole is a Midwestern classic that became a nationwide phenomenon in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe layered seasoned ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, frozen mixed vegetables, and topped everything with frozen tater tots. The casserole baked until the tater tots were golden and crispy and the filling was bubbling. The result was a dinner that kids loved and adults found surprisingly satisfying. In the 1950s, tater tot casserole was revolutionary because it used tater tots, which had just been invented by Ora Ida in 1953. The casserole quickly became popular because it was easy, cheap, and kids would actually eat it. The tater tots on top made it feel like junk food, but the vegetables and meat made it a complete meal. The genius of tater tot casserole was how the tots acted as both topping and starch. They got crispy on top while the bottoms softened and absorbed some of the sauce from the meat below. Every bite had crispy tater tot, creamy soup, savory beef, and tender vegetables. The flavor was straightforward comfort food. The ground beef was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and onion powder. The cream of mushroom soup made everything creamy. The mixed vegetables added pops of sweetness. The tater tots added potato flavor and crunch. Tater tot casserole is still made today, especially in the Midwest, but it's seen as lowbrow and unsophisticated. But it's incredibly practical. The casserole costs about $8, $3 for ground beef, $2 for tater tots, $3 for soup and vegetables. It feeds 6 people. Salmon and rice casserole was a budget-friendly casserole that used canned salmon instead of expensive fresh fish. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined canned salmon, cooked rice, frozen peas, a cream sauce made from butter and milk, and topped everything with crushed crackers. The result was a casserole that was mild, creamy, and surprisingly elegant, despite its humble ingredients. In the 1950s, canned salmon was cheaper than canned tuna, which made this casserole even more economical than tuna noodle casserole. Salmon and rice casserole was popular on the West Coast where salmon fishing was common, but it appeared nationwide because canned salmon was available everywhere. The genius of this casserole was how it stretched expensive protein. 1 can of salmon cost about 30 cents, but fed 6 people when combined with rice and vegetables. Corned beef and cabbage casserole transformed the traditional Irish-American boiled dinner into an easy casserole. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined diced corned beef, shredded cabbage, cooked potatoes, and a mustard cream sauce, then baked everything until the cabbage softened and the top got golden. The result was a casserole that had all the flavors of corned beef and cabbage, but in a more convenient form. In the 1950s, corned beef and cabbage casserole was popular the day after St. Patrick's Day when families had leftover corned beef. The casserole was also made with canned corned beef, which was cheap and available year-round. The dish was especially popular in Irish-American communities in the Northeast. The genius of this casserole was the mustard cream sauce. Corned beef is salty and rich, and cabbage can be bland. The mustard added tanginess that cut through the richness and brightened the cabbage. The potatoes made the casserole hearty and filling. The flavor was bold and savory. The corned beef was salty and slightly spicy from its curing spices. The cabbage was mild and slightly sweet. The mustard sauce added tang and creaminess. The potatoes absorbed all the flavors. Corned beef and cabbage casserole disappeared when corned beef became less common outside St. Patrick's Day. By the 1980s, most people only ate corned beef once a year. The casserole was forgotten, but this casserole is worth making. It costs about $12, $6 for corned beef, $2 for cabbage, $2 for potatoes, $2 for cream and mustard. It feeds 6 people. Chicken tetrazzini was an Italian-American casserole that became wildly popular in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe combined cooked chicken, spaghetti, mushrooms, peas, and a cream sauce made from chicken broth, butter, and cream, all topped with Parmesan cheese and baked until golden. The result was a casserole that was creamy, cheesy, and sophisticated. In the 1950s, chicken tetrazzini was considered an elegant casserole. It was named after Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, and it appeared at dinner parties and ladies' luncheons. The casserole was rich and indulgent, not everyday food, but special occasion food. Spanish rice casserole was a Tex-Mex-inspired dish that combined ground beef, rice, tomatoes, peppers, and spices in one casserole. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe browned ground beef with onions and peppers, mixed it with rice, tomato sauce, and spices, then baked everything together until the rice was tender and the top was slightly crispy. The result was a casserole that was flavorful, slightly spicy, and incredibly filling. In the 1950s, Spanish rice casserole was popular across the Southwest and gradually spread nationwide. The casserole was economical. Ground beef and rice were both cheap, and the spices, chili powder, cumin, garlic, gave the dish big flavor without expensive ingredients. The genius of Spanish rice casserole was how the rice cooked directly in the casserole dish. You didn't need to cook it separately. The rice absorbed all the flavors from the beef, tomatoes, and spices, and it came out perfectly tender. The flavor was bold and savory. The ground beef was seasoned heavily with chili powder and cumin. The tomato sauce added acidity and sweetness. The peppers added crunch and mild heat. The rice absorbed everything and became incredibly flavorful. Baked macaroni and cheese in the 1950s was nothing like the boxed version. Betty Crocker's recipe made a real cheese sauce from butter, flour, milk, and sharp cheddar cheese, mixed it with cooked macaroni, topped it with buttered breadcrumbs, and baked it until the top was golden and crispy. The result was mac and cheese that was creamy, sharp, rich, and had a satisfying crunch on top. In the 1950s, baked macaroni and cheese was a side dish at Sunday dinners and holiday meals. It was comfort food that both kids and adults loved. The cheese sauce was made from real cheese, which gave it a sharp, tangy flavor that boxed mac and cheese could never match. Baked macaroni and cheese is still made today, but many people use boxed mac and cheese or Velveeta instead of real cheese sauce. The from-scratch version costs about $10, $3 for cheese, $2 for pasta, $2 for milk and butter, $3 for breadcrumbs. It feeds 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is the gold standard. Beef and noodle bake was a simple casserole that combined ground beef, egg noodles, tomato sauce, and cottage cheese. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered cooked noodles with a meat sauce and cottage cheese, then topped everything with shredded cheddar and baked it. The result was a casserole that tasted like lasagna but was easier to make. The flavor was comforting and familiar. The beef was seasoned with Italian herbs, basil, oregano, garlic. The tomato sauce was tangy and slightly sweet. The cottage cheese added creaminess. The cheddar on top melted into gooey puddles. Beef and noodle bake disappeared when cottage cheese fell out of favor in the 1980s. By the 1990s, most people used ricotta in pasta dishes. The casserole was forgotten. But beef and noodle bake is practical and delicious. It costs about $10, $3 for ground beef, $2 for noodles, $2 for cottage cheese, $3 for tomato sauce and cheddar. It feeds 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is straightforward. Turkey and stuffing casserole was the best way to use up Thanksgiving leftovers. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered leftover turkey, leftover stuffing, cranberry sauce, and gravy in a casserole dish, topped it with mashed potatoes, and baked everything until hot and golden. The result was Thanksgiving dinner in casserole form, all the best flavors in one dish. The flavor was pure Thanksgiving. The turkey was savory and mild. The stuffing was herby and rich. The cranberry sauce added sweetness and tang. The gravy made everything moist. The mashed potatoes on top were creamy and buttery. Turkey and stuffing casserole is still made today, but less commonly. Most people prefer to eat Thanksgiving leftovers as is, rather than transforming them. The casserole costs nothing extra if using leftovers. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic. Pork chop and rice casserole was a one-dish dinner that combined pork chops, uncooked rice, onion soup mix, and water in a casserole dish, then baked everything together. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe created a meal where the pork chops cooked in their own juices, the rice absorbed all the flavors, and everything came out tender and delicious. The genius of this casserole was the onion soup mix. It provided all the seasoning, salt, onion flavor, herbs. The pork chops released their fat and juices into the rice below, making every grain flavorful. The result was a complete meal with protein and starch. The flavor was savory and comforting. The pork chops were tender and well-seasoned. The rice was flavorful and slightly sticky. The onion soup mix added a rich, savory depth. Pork chop and rice casserole is still made today, but less commonly. The casserole costs about $12, $8 for pork chops, $2 for rice, $2 for onion soup mix. It feeds 4 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is foolproof. Scalloped potatoes and ham was the ultimate comfort food casserole. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered thinly sliced potatoes with diced ham and a cream sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then baked everything until the potatoes were tender and the top was golden. The result was a casserole that was creamy, rich, and incredibly satisfying. The flavor was rich and indulgent. The potatoes were creamy and tender. The ham was salty and smoky. The cream sauce was velvety and seasoned with just salt, pepper, and a hint of nutmeg. Every layer was infused with flavor. Scalloped potatoes and ham is still made today, but less commonly than in the 1950s. The casserole costs about $12, $5 for ham, $4 for potatoes, $3 for cream and butter. It feeds 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic version with the perfect cream-to-potato ratio. Tuna and potato chip casserole was a variation on tuna noodle casserole that used crushed potato chips instead of breadcrumbs. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined canned tuna, cooked egg noodles, frozen peas, cream of celery soup, and topped everything with crushed potato chips. The result was a casserole that was creamy, crunchy, salty, and surprisingly addictive. Tuna and potato chip casserole disappeared when casseroles in general fell out of fashion in the 1980s. The use of potato chips was seen as trashy and low class. By the 1990s, the casserole was rare. But tuna and potato chip casserole is delicious in its simplicity. It costs about $8, $2 for tuna, $2 for noodles, $2 for soup, $2 for chips and peas. It feeds 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is straightforward and nostalgic. Sausage and bean casserole was a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs dinner. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined browned sausage links, canned baked beans, diced onions, brown sugar, and mustard in a casserole dish. Then baked everything until the beans were bubbling and the top was slightly caramelized. The result was a casserole that was sweet, savory, smoky, and incredibly filling. The flavor was bold and satisfying. The sausage released its fat into the beans, making everything rich. The brown sugar caramelized on top. The mustard cut through the sweetness. The beans were thick and hearty. Sausage and bean casserole is still made today, especially at church potlucks and summer cookouts, but it's less common at regular dinners. The casserole costs about $10, $5 for sausage, $3 for beans, $2 for onions and brown sugar. It feeds 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic version. Chicken and biscuit casserole was the 1950s version of chicken pot pie. Betty Crocker's recipe combined cooked chicken, mixed vegetables, cream of chicken soup, and topped everything with biscuit dough that baked into fluffy golden biscuits. The result was a casserole that was creamy, comforting, and had a satisfying contrast between the soft filling and the fluffy biscuits. In the 1950s, chicken and biscuit casserole was popular because it was easier than making pie crust. You mixed everything together, dropped biscuit dough on top, and baked it. The biscuits rose and turned golden while the filling bubbled below. The genius of this casserole was how the biscuits absorbed some of the filling. The bottoms of the biscuits got soft and creamy from the soup, while the tops stayed fluffy and golden. Every bite had tender chicken, vegetables, creamy sauce, and soft biscuit. Chicken and biscuit casserole is still made today, but less commonly. The casserole costs about $12, $6 for chicken, $3 for vegetables and soup, $3 for biscuit ingredients. It feeds 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe uses homemade biscuits. which are better than store-bought. 20 casseroles down, 10 to go. And we're getting into the truly regional territory now. The casseroles that were popular in specific states or regions, the ones that never made it mainstream, the ones that only appeared in church cookbooks and community fundraisers. But every single one was a regular dinner for some American family in the 1950s, and every single one fed a crowd for under $10. Let's finish strong with the final 10. Chili Mac Casserole combined two American favorites, chili and macaroni, into one easy casserole. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered cooked macaroni with homemade chili made from ground beef, kidney beans, tomatoes, and chili powder, then topped everything with shredded cheddar cheese. The result was a casserole that was spicy, cheesy, hearty, and kid-friendly. In the 1950s, Chili Mac Casserole was popular in the Midwest and South. It was economical. Ground beef, beans, and macaroni were all cheap. The casserole was also practical because you could make a huge batch and feed a crowd. The genius of Chili Mac Casserole was how the macaroni absorbed the chili. The pasta soaked up all the spices and tomato flavor, becoming incredibly flavorful. The cheese on top melted into gooey puddles. Every bite was different. Sometimes you got mostly chili, sometimes mostly macaroni. The flavor was bold and spicy. The chili was seasoned with chili powder, cumin, and garlic. The beans added earthiness. The macaroni added substance. The cheese added creaminess and richness. Hamburger and green bean casserole was a Midwestern staple that combined ground beef, canned green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and topped everything with crispy fried onions. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe created a casserole that was similar to green bean casserole, but heartier because of the ground beef. In the 1950s, this casserole was popular because it was filling and economical. The ground beef made it a complete meal. The green beans added vegetables. The soup made everything creamy. The fried onions on top added crunch. The genius of this casserole was how simple it was. You browned ground beef, stirred in green beans and soup, topped it with onions, and baked it. The entire process took 30 minutes. The flavor was straightforward comfort food. The ground beef was savory. The green beans were mild and slightly sweet. The mushroom soup was creamy and earthy. The fried onions were crispy and sweet. Hamburger and green bean casserole is still made today in the Midwest, but less commonly elsewhere. Hot dish is what Minnesotans call casserole, and it's a cultural institution. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe for classic Minnesota hot dish combined ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, frozen corn, frozen green beans, and topped everything with tater tots. The result was a casserole that was hearty, creamy, and quintessentially Midwestern. In the 1950s, hot dish became the unofficial state dish of Minnesota. Every church potluck, funeral luncheon, and community gathering featured multiple hot dishes. The name hot dish distinguished it from cold salads. It was a hot, one-dish meal that fed a crowd. The genius of hot dish was its flexibility. The base was always ground beef and cream of mushroom soup, but you could add any vegetables you had on hand and top it with anything crunchy: tater tots, potato chips, French fried onions, crushed crackers. The flavor was mild and comforting. The ground beef was simply seasoned. The soup made everything creamy. The vegetables added texture. The tater tots on top were crispy and salty. Hot dish is still made today in Minnesota and surrounding states, but it's rare outside the upper Midwest. Funeral potatoes got their name because they appeared at every funeral luncheon in Utah and Idaho. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined frozen hash browns, sour cream, cream of chicken soup, shredded cheddar cheese, and topped everything with crushed cornflakes mixed with melted butter. The result was a casserole that was creamy, cheesy, crunchy, and incredibly rich. In the 1950s, funeral potatoes were popular in Mormon communities across Utah, Idaho, and other western states. The casserole was always present at church gatherings, funerals, and holiday dinners. It was comfort food that could be made ahead and fed a large crowd. The genius of funeral potatoes was the cornflake topping. The cornflakes mixed with butter got incredibly crispy and added a sweet, crunchy contrast to the creamy potatoes below. The combination of sour cream and soup made the potatoes incredibly rich. The flavor was indulgent. The hash browns were tender and absorbed all the cream. The sour cream added tanginess. The cheese added richness. The cornflake topping was buttery and slightly sweet. Egg noodle and cottage cheese casserole was a simple, protein-rich side dish. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined cooked egg noodles with cottage cheese, sour cream, eggs, and butter, then baked everything until the top was golden. The result was a casserole that was creamy, rich, and had a texture similar to kugel. In the 1950s, this casserole was popular in Jewish American households as a variation on noodle kugel. It was also made by non-Jewish families who appreciated the simplicity and economy. The cottage cheese added protein and creaminess without needing expensive cheese. The genius of this casserole was its simplicity. 5 ingredients created something rich and satisfying. The eggs bound everything together. The cottage cheese added tang and creaminess. The sour cream made it luxurious. The flavor was mild and comforting. The noodles were soft and buttery. The cottage cheese added tanginess. The eggs made it rich. The top got slightly crispy and golden. Goulash casserole was an American interpretation of Hungarian goulash. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomatoes, peppers, onions, and paprika in a casserole dish, then baked everything together. The result was a casserole that was hearty, slightly spicy, and had a distinctive paprika flavor. In the 1950s, American goulash was different from Hungarian goulash. It used ground beef instead of beef chunks, macaroni instead of potatoes, and was baked instead of simmered. The casserole was popular in the Midwest, where Hungarian immigrants had settled. The genius of American goulash was its simplicity. You browned ground beef with vegetables, stirred in cooked macaroni and tomatoes, seasoned everything with paprika, and baked it. The result was a complete meal. The flavor was bold and slightly sweet. The paprika added a distinctive smoky, slightly sweet flavor. The peppers and onions added sweetness. The tomatoes added acidity. The beef added richness. American chop suey bake was a New England casserole that had nothing to do with Chinese food. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, onions, and peppers in a casserole dish, topped it with cheese, and baked it. The result was essentially a baked version of goulash with a different name. In the 1950s, American chop suey was popular in New England, especially Massachusetts. The name was confusing. It wasn't Chinese at all. It was just a ground beef and macaroni casserole. Some theories suggest it was called chop suey because it was a chopped-up mixture of ingredients. The genius of American chop suey was its versatility. You could add any vegetables you had: peppers, celery, mushrooms, corn. The base was always ground beef, macaroni, and tomato sauce, but everything else was flexible. The flavor was straightforward comfort food. The ground beef was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and Italian herbs. 7-layer casserole was exactly what it sounds like, a casserole with 7 distinct layers that created a visually stunning and incredibly practical one-pot meal. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe layered uncooked rice, canned corn, diced tomatoes, ground beef, onions, peppers, and bacon on top, then covered everything with tomato juice and baked it for 2 hours. The result was a casserole where each layer remained distinct but flavored everything else, creating a complete dinner that looked as impressive as it tasted. In the 1950s, 7-layer casserole was popular because it was impressive and required minimal prep work. You literally just layered everything raw in a casserole dish, poured tomato juice over it, covered it tightly with foil, and baked it. No browning the beef. No pre-cooking the rice, no sautéing the vegetables, no complicated steps whatsoever. You assembled it in 10 minutes, put it in the oven, and walked away for 2 hours. This made it perfect for busy weeknights or when you needed to prepare dinner ahead of time. The layering order was crucial to the casserole's success. You'd start with uncooked long-grain white rice, spread evenly across the bottom of a deep 9x 13-inch casserole dish. The rice formed the foundation and would absorb all the liquid during baking. After the ground beef came sliced onions, spread in a thin layer. The onions would soften and turn translucent during baking, adding sweetness and depth. Next were sliced bell peppers, usually green peppers, though some cooks used a mix of colors. The peppers added freshness and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the corn and tomatoes. Finally, on the very top, you'd lay strips of raw bacon. The bacon served multiple purposes. It flavored everything below as its fat rendered, it kept the casserole moist, and it crisped up to create a beautiful, crispy topping. Once all 7 layers were assembled, you'd pour tomato juice over the entire casserole, usually about 2 to 3 cups. Enough to nearly cover all the layers. The tomato juice was essential because it provided the liquid the rice needed to cook, and it carried flavors throughout the casserole. You'd season the top with salt, pepper, and sometimes a sprinkle of sugar to balance the acidity of the tomatoes. Then you'd cover the dish tightly with aluminum foil to trap the steam, which helped cook the rice and keep everything moist. The casserole baked at 350 degrees for about 90 minutes covered, then you'd remove the foil and bake for another 30 minutes to crisp up the bacon on top and allow some of the liquid to evaporate. During baking, something magical happened. The rice absorbed the tomato juice, the beef drippings, and all the vegetable flavors. The ground beef cooked through and released its fat, which enriched everything. The vegetables softened and melded together. The bacon rendered and crisped up. When you pulled it out of the oven, the casserole was bubbling, the bacon was crispy and golden, and the house smelled incredible. The genius of 7-layer casserole was how the layers remained visible when you served it. When you cut into the casserole and lifted out a serving, you could see each distinct ingredient: white rice at the bottom, yellow corn, red tomatoes, brown beef, translucent onions, green peppers, and dark, crispy bacon on top. The presentation was beautiful and made the casserole feel special, even though it was made with the most basic ingredients. Each layer contributed something different: texture, flavor, color, moisture. The flavor was a complete meal in one dish. The rice at the bottom was the star. It absorbed all the tomato juice and beef drippings, making it incredibly flavorful and slightly sticky, almost like Spanish rice. The corn added pockets of sweetness that burst in your mouth. The tomatoes provided acidity and brightness. The beef added savory, meaty richness. The onions and peppers contributed depth and complexity. The bacon on top added smokiness, salt, and that irresistible crispy texture. Every forkful was different depending on which layers you got, which made eating it interesting from first bite to last. 7-layer casserole was also incredibly practical. It fed 8 people easily, and it was one of the most economical dinners you could make. All the ingredients were cheap and readily available. Rice was pennies per pound. Canned corn and tomatoes cost less than $1 per can, ground beef was affordable, and vegetables were cheap. The total cost was usually around $3 to $4 for the entire casserole, which worked out to about 50 cents per person. In an era when families were large and budgets were tight, this kind of value was essential. The casserole was also extremely forgiving. If you didn't have all 7 layers, you could adjust. No bacon? Use sausage or skip the meat topping altogether. No peppers? Add more onions. No corn? Use another can of tomatoes. The base formula, rice, liquid, ground beef, vegetables, was flexible enough to accommodate whatever you had in your pantry. Some families added a layer of sliced potatoes. Others added a layer of kidney beans. The casserole adapted to what was available. 7-layer. Casserole is rare today. Most people have never heard of it. The layered casserole concept fell out of fashion in the 1980s when people wanted faster cooking methods and more sophisticated flavors. By the 1990s, casseroles that required 2 hours of baking seemed impractical when you could microwave something in 5 minutes. The casserole was forgotten outside of a few families who kept making it because their grandmothers had made it. But 7-layer casserole deserves a comeback. Yes, it takes 2 hours to bake, but it only takes 10 minutes to assemble. And once it's in the oven, you can forget about it. There's no stirring, no checking, no babysitting. It's true set-it-and-forget-it cooking, and the result is a complete, satisfying, economical meal that feeds 8 people. The casserole costs about $12 to make in today's prices. $3 for ground beef, $2 for rice, $2 for bacon, $5 for canned vegetables and tomato juice. That's $1.50 per person for a complete dinner. You can't get a fast food burger for that price. The casserole also reheats beautifully. Leftovers can be stored in the refrigerator for up to 4 days and reheated in the microwave or oven. The flavors actually improve overnight as everything continues to meld together. Some families intentionally made 7-layer casserole on Sunday so they could eat leftovers throughout the week. Betty Crocker's recipe is unique and impressive. The layering technique creates visual drama, and the hands-off cooking method makes it practical for modern busy families. If you want a casserole that looks complicated but is actually simple, feeds a crowd for almost nothing, and tastes like something your grandmother would have made, 7-layer casserole is the answer. This is forgotten 1950s cooking at its finest. Salmon loaf casserole was a variation on meatloaf that used canned salmon instead of ground beef, creating a protein-rich dinner that was economical, elegant, and completely different from the typical beef-based casseroles. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined canned salmon with breadcrumbs, eggs, milk, finely chopped onions, celery, and seasonings, shaped the mixture into a loaf, placed it in a casserole dish, surrounded by chunks of vegetables, and baked everything together until the salmon loaf was golden and firm and the vegetables were tender. The result was a complete one-dish dinner that was light, flavorful, and surprisingly sophisticated. In the 1950s, salmon loaf was popular on the West Coast, where salmon fishing was a major industry, and canned salmon was abundant and cheap. It was also popular in Catholic households across the country, where fish was required on Fridays and during Lent. Salmon loaf provided a way to serve fish that felt substantial and satisfying, more like a real dinner than just a piece of fried fish. The salmon loaf was milder and lighter than meatloaf, making it appealing to people who didn't typically enjoy fish. The genius of salmon loaf casserole was how it turned cheap canned salmon into an impressive dinner that looked and tasted like something from a restaurant. Canned salmon in the 1950s cost about 35 cents per can, which was actually cheaper than canned tuna. 1 can of salmon, when combined with breadcrumbs and eggs, could be stretched to feed 6 people. The loaf format made it feel substantial and dinner-worthy, and the vegetables baked alongside turned it into a complete meal. The preparation was straightforward. You'd drain 2 cans of salmon and flake it into a large bowl, removing any skin and large bones, though some cooks left in the tiny bones for extra calcium. To the salmon, you'd add fine breadcrumbs, beaten eggs, milk, finely chopped onions and celery, lemon juice, salt, pepper, and dried dill or parsley. The mixture was stirred together until it held together but wasn't overmixed. You wanted it cohesive enough to form a loaf, but not so dense that it became pasty. The salmon mixture was shaped into a loaf, about 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, and placed in the center of a large casserole dish. Around the loaf, you'd arrange chunks of vegetables, quartered potatoes, thick slices of carrots, chunks of onions, and sometimes celery stalks, cut into large pieces. The vegetables were drizzled with melted butter and seasoned with salt and pepper. Some cooks added a splash of white wine or chicken broth to the bottom of the dish to keep everything moist and create a light sauce. The casserole baked at 350 degrees oven for about 45 to 50 minutes. During baking, the salmon loaf firmed up and developed a golden crust on the outside while staying moist and tender inside. The vegetables roasted alongside, absorbing the salmon flavor from the juices that dripped down. The house would smell like the ocean mixed with roasted vegetables, briny, savory, and inviting. The loaf held together perfectly when sliced. Unlike fish fillets that flake apart, the salmon loaf had structure from the breadcrumbs and eggs, allowing you to cut clean slices that held their shape on the plate. The texture was similar to meatloaf, but lighter and more delicate. Each slice had visible flecks of pink salmon throughout a golden brown exterior. The flavor was delicate and mild, perfect for people who claimed they didn't like fish. By the 1990s, most people under 40 had never tasted canned salmon, let alone salmon loaf. The dish became associated with poverty and Depression-era cooking, and it vanished from most American tables. But salmon loaf casserole is worth trying, especially if you're looking for a budget-friendly fish dinner that's different from the usual baked or fried fish. The casserole costs about $12 to make, $3 for 2 cans of salmon, $2 for breadcrumbs and eggs, $7 for vegetables, potatoes, carrots, onions. It feeds 6 people, which is $2 per person for a complete protein and vegetable dinner. Compare that to buying fresh salmon fillets at $12 to $15 per pound, and the canned version suddenly seems reasonable. The dish is also practical. It can be assembled several hours ahead and refrigerated until you're ready to bake it. The salmon loaf mixture can even be made the night before and shaped into a loaf in the morning, making dinner prep on a busy weeknight incredibly easy. And because everything bakes together in one dish, cleanup is minimal, just 1 casserole dish and a few prep bowls. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic version, but it's flexible. Don't like dill? Use tarragon or basil. Want more vegetables? Add green beans or peas around the loaf. Prefer a different sauce? Make a simple butter-lemon sauce or a cream sauce with capers. The salmon loaf itself is mild and adaptable, making it a blank canvas for whatever flavors you prefer. This is forgotten 1950s cooking that deserves another look. Stuffed pepper casserole deconstructed traditional stuffed peppers into an easier, more practical casserole form that delivered all the same flavors with a fraction of the work. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined ground beef, cooked rice, diced bell peppers, tomato sauce, onions, garlic, and Italian spices in a large casserole dish, topped it with shredded mozzarella or cheddar cheese, and baked everything until the cheese melted into a golden, bubbly top. The result was all the flavors of stuffed peppers, sweet peppers, savory beef, tender rice, tangy tomato sauce, without the tedious work of hollowing out peppers and stuffing them individually. In the 1950s, stuffed pepper casserole was popular because it was faster and more practical than making traditional stuffed peppers. Traditional stuffed peppers required you to carefully cut the tops off bell peppers, remove the seeds and membranes, blanch the peppers to soften them, make a filling, stuff each pepper individually, stand them upright in a baking dish, which was always tricky, and bake them carefully so they didn't tip over. It was time-consuming and fussy. Stuffed pepper casserole eliminated all that fussiness. You just diced the peppers, mixed everything together, dumped it in a dish, and baked it. Done. The genius of this casserole was how it simplified a classic dish without sacrificing flavor. Instead of stuffing 4 to 6 peppers that served one person each, you made one large casserole that fed 8 people. The flavors were identical: beef, rice, peppers, tomatoes, but the preparation was dramatically easier. And because the peppers were diced instead of left whole, every bite had pepper in it, which wasn't always the case with traditional stuffed peppers, where you might get mostly filling with only a little pepper. The preparation was straightforward and quick. You'd brown ground beef in a large skillet with diced onions and minced garlic until the beef was cooked through and the onions were soft. Then you'd drain off any excess fat and stir in cooked rice, usually leftover rice or rice you'd cooked earlier in the day. Diced bell peppers, a mix of colors, looked beautiful: red, green, yellow. Tomato sauce, a can of diced tomatoes, and seasonings: salt, pepper, dried basil, dried oregano, and sometimes a pinch of red pepper flakes for heat. The mixture was stirred together until everything was combined, then transferred to a greased 9-set 13-inch casserole dish and spread into an even layer. Some cooks added a little beef broth or water to the mixture if it seemed dry. The liquid helped keep everything moist during baking and ensured the rice didn't dry out. The casserole was covered with foil and baked at 350 degrees for about 30 minutes, which allowed all the flavors to meld together and the peppers to soften. After 30 minutes, you'd remove the foil and sprinkle shredded cheese over the top, either mozzarella for an Italian flavor or cheddar for a more American taste. The casserole went back in the oven uncovered for another 10 to 15 minutes, just long enough for the cheese to melt completely and turn golden and slightly bubbly around the edges. When you pulled it out, the cheese formed a beautiful golden blanket over the beef and peppers below, and the casserole was bubbling hot and smelled incredible. The flavor was exactly like stuffed peppers, familiar, comforting, and satisfying. The ground beef was seasoned perfectly with Italian herbs, giving it that classic stuffed pepper taste. The peppers added sweetness and a slight bitterness that balanced the richness of the beef. The rice absorbed the tomato sauce and became tender and flavorful. The cheese on top added creaminess, saltiness, and that irresistible gooey texture. Every forkful had all the components: beef, rice, peppers, tomatoes, cheese, in perfect proportion. The casserole could feed 8 people easily, whereas traditional stuffed peppers typically only made enough for 4 or 5, 1 or 2 peppers per person. This made stuffed pepper casserole ideal for feeding a crowd or for families who wanted leftovers. The casserole also reheated beautifully. Leftovers could be microwaved or reheated in the oven, and they tasted just as good the next day. Stuffed pepper casserole is still made today, though it's less common than traditional stuffed peppers. Many home cooks have never heard of the casserole version and continue to make the fussier traditional version. But once you make stuffed pepper casserole, you'll never go back to stuffing individual peppers. The casserole is faster, easier, feeds more people, and tastes exactly the same. The casserole costs about $10 to make, $3 for 1 pound of ground beef, $2 for rice, $2 for bell peppers, $3 for tomato sauce, cheese, and aromatics. It feeds 8 people, which is $1.25 per person for a complete, satisfying dinner. You can also make it cheaper by using leftover rice and whatever peppers are on sale. Betty Crocker's recipe is practical and delicious, but it's also flexible. Want to make it healthier? Use ground turkey instead of beef and brown rice instead of white rice. Want more vegetables? Add diced zucchini, mushrooms, or corn. Want it spicier? Add jalapenos or more red pepper flakes. Want it cheesier? Double the cheese or mix in some cheese with the filling. The base recipe is simple and forgiving, and it welcomes improvisation. Stuffed pepper casserole represents exactly what 1950s casserole cooking was all about, taking a classic time-consuming dish and making it faster, easier, and more practical without sacrificing flavor. This is smart home cooking that's been forgotten. It's time to bring it back. 30 casseroles. Every single one was a regular dinner in 1950s America. Every single one fed a family for under $10. Every single one required only one dish to clean. We replaced these practical, economical, delicious dinners with takeout that costs $30 and meal kits that cost $50. We traded skill for convenience, and we lost something important. These casseroles weren't just food. They were how families survived on tight budgets. They were how grandmothers fed 8 people with $5 worth of groceries. They were how communities came together at potlucks and church dinners. These recipes still work. They're still economical. They're still delicious. And they're still better than takeout. Pick one of these 30 casseroles and make it this week. Just one. Try tuna noodle casserole made from scratch, or King Ranch chicken or funeral potatoes. Try something your grandmother made. Bake it in a Pyrex dish and serve it straight from the oven. Let me know in the comments which casserole you're making. And if you want 30 more forgotten Betty Crocker one-pot dinners, I'll see you in the next video.